Tell me you're lying. Jimin wouldn't leave the stage like that. Suga's voice cracked as he grabbed the manager's arm, his hands trembling so violently that everyone in the backstage hallway froze. You saw him smiling just minutes ago, the manager whispered, unable to meet Suga's eyes. He kept smiling because he didn't want anyone to notice. The distant roar of thousands of fans still echoed through the stadium, completely unaware that something had changed behind the curtain. Jungkook took one hesitant step forward. RM lowered his head in silence, while Jin stood frozen with disbelief written across his face. Then Suga's breathing became uneven, his vision blurred, and before anyone could reach him, his body suddenly collapsed onto the cold backstage floor. But the real question was never why Suga fainted. It was what had Jimin hidden from everyone until that very moment. And if you had been standing there beside them, would you have told Suga the truth immediately, or kept the painful secret hidden just a little longer? Share your thoughts below before we continue. Only a few minutes earlier, nothing about the evening suggested that it would become a memory impossible for anyone present to forget. The final concert of BTS's North American tour had transformed the massive stadium into a sea of synchronized lights, with tens of thousands of ARMY waving glowing light sticks beneath the warm summer sky. The final notes of the encore still lingered in the air as confetti drifted slowly toward the stage, catching the bright white spotlights like tiny pieces of floating glass. The audience continued chanting the members' names long after the music had faded, hoping for one last wave, one last smile, one more unforgettable moment before the lights came up. Behind the curtains, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. The deafening cheers outside became distant echoes muffled by thick concrete walls, replaced by the hurried footsteps of staff members rolling equipment cases through narrow hallways, the static chatter of production radios, and exhausted breaths from dancers peeling off sweat-soaked jackets. The scent of stage smoke mixed with fresh towels and bottled water filled the backstage corridors where everyone moved with practiced urgency. Jimin walked several steps ahead of the others, still wearing the same gentle smile that millions of fans had just seen on the giant stadium screens. Sweat glistened along his forehead, his hair damp from the demanding performance. Yet he greeted every passing crew member with the same polite nod and soft words of gratitude that had become second nature to him. To anyone watching, he looked tired but satisfied, exactly how an artist might appear after pouring every ounce of energy into a sold-out performance. Suga followed a few meters behind, quietly observing him without saying much. He had known Jimin long enough to recognize that smiles could sometimes become carefully built walls. During rehearsals over the past week, he had caught tiny moments that seemed insignificant on their own. Jimin occasionally paused before standing, subtly shifted his weight away from one leg, or briefly closed his eyes after intense choreography as though steadying himself before anyone noticed. Whenever Suga asked if everything was all right, Jimin answered with the same reassuring grin. "I'm just tired. Don't worry, Hyung." Those words had become so familiar that even Suga wanted to believe them. After all, exhaustion was normal during an international tour. Everyone carried bruises, sore muscles, and sleepless nights without complaint. They all understood that reality. Still, something refused to settle in Suga's mind. It was never one obvious sign, but dozens of tiny details quietly collecting over time. Earlier that afternoon during soundcheck, Jimin had remained alone on the edge of the stage for several extra minutes after everyone else returned backstage. He had been looking into the empty seats as if searching for something invisible beyond the rows of chairs. Suga approached him and casually asked what he was thinking about. Jimin answered after a long silence. "Do you ever wonder how much of ourselves people can see, and how much they never will?" Suga laughed softly, assuming Jimin had become philosophical from fatigue. "Probably less than we think." Jimin simply nodded before changing the subject. Looking back, that conversation suddenly felt far heavier than it had at the time. Once the concert ended, the members slowly gathered in the backstage lounge. Jungkook excitedly replayed a funny interaction with fans from the encore, while J-Hope teased him for nearly missing a dance cue after laughing too hard. V stretched across the couch with dramatic exhaustion, insisting he would sleep for 2 days straight, making everyone chuckle. RM thanked the dancers and musicians one by one, while Gene handed bottled water to nearby staff members before taking one for himself. It felt like countless other nights after successful performances, filled with relief, laughter, and quiet gratitude. Even Jimin joined in, laughing at Jungkook's animated storytelling. Though every now and then his fingers tightened around the unopened water bottle in his hand. Across the room, one of the veteran backstage coordinators watched him with growing concern. She had worked with touring artists for nearly 20 years and had developed an instinct for noticing things others overlooked. She quietly approached Jimin and asked if he wanted the medical team to take a quick look before everyone left for the hotel. Jimin smiled politely and declined. "Thank you. I just need a little rest." His answer sounded calm enough that she chose not to insist. Yet as she walked away, she noticed him briefly steadying himself against the wall when he thought no one was looking.
Proper checkup before continuing travel. Jimin stared at the message for a long moment before locking his phone without replying. Suga noticed. "What was that?" Jimin hesitated. "Nothing serious." But this time Suga did not accept the answer. "You always say that when something is serious." The room became quiet again. Jimin looked away, and for the first time Suga saw something beneath the calm expression, a mixture of fear, guilt, and exhaustion that Jimin had been carrying alone. However, neither of them knew that the situation was about to become much bigger than a private conversation between two friends. Because later that day, during preparations for another public appearance, a small moment would reveal what Jimin had been desperately trying to protect everyone from knowing. And when Suga finally discovered the full truth, it would challenge not only his understanding of Jimin's pain, but also the promise they had made to always stand beside each other. The next few hours moved faster than anyone expected. What began as a quiet concern behind closed doors slowly started becoming impossible to ignore. The schedule for the day had been carefully planned weeks in advance: a short media appearance, a meeting with the production team, and a final gathering with the dancers and musicians who had shared the long journey across countries with them. Everyone understood that exhaustion was part of touring, but nobody expected the hidden struggle Jimin had been carrying to surface in such a painful way. Inside the rehearsal hall, bright ceiling lights reflected against the polished floor as the members gathered for one final practice before leaving the city. The room was filled with familiar sounds, the beat of music coming from the speakers, footsteps following choreography, and the occasional laughter when someone made a small mistake. For everyone else, it looked like another ordinary day of preparation, but Suga watched differently now. He noticed every pause, every deep breath, every moment when Jimin forced himself to keep moving. During rehearsal, Jimin missed a transition he had performed thousands of times before. It was only a small mistake, something most people would never notice, but Suga immediately saw it. Jimin quickly apologized and repeated the movement. "Sorry, my timing was off." J-Hope looked over with concern. "You don't usually miss that part." Jimin smiled and shrugged. "Just tired." Those two words again, the same answer he had given everyone, the same answer that was beginning to worry them more. RM stopped the music for a moment and looked around the room. "Let's take a short break." Nobody argued. The members had learned over the years that sometimes the strongest thing they could do was recognize when someone needed a moment. Jimin sat down near the mirror, drinking water slowly while staring at his reflection. He looked like the same person fans saw on stage, but the tiredness in his eyes told a different story. Jin quietly placed a snack beside him without saying anything. It was a small gesture, but one that showed he understood. "Eat something," Jin said casually. "You always tell everyone else to take care of themselves." Jimin smiled. "You noticed?" Jin laughed softly. "We all noticed." Those words affected him more than Jin realized, because deep down, Jimin had believed he was hiding everything perfectly. He thought if he kept smiling, kept performing, and kept saying he was fine, the people around him would never have to carry his worries. But he was beginning to understand that hiding pain from people who loved him did not protect them. It only kept them away from the chance to help. Later that afternoon, the members attended a small meeting with the concert crew. The atmosphere was relaxed, with staff members sharing memories from the tour and thanking the artists for their professionalism. One of the lighting directors spoke about how Jimin always stayed behind after rehearsals to thank every crew member individually. Another staff member mentioned how he remembered the names of dancers and technicians that most people overlooked. Everyone smiled while listening. But in the corner of the room, Suga noticed something unusual. Jimin was not listening the way he normally did. His eyes were focused, but his expression seemed far away, as if his mind was somewhere else. When the meeting ended, people began leaving one by one. Jimin remained behind for a moment, looking at the empty stage area visible through the glass doors. Suga approached him slowly. "You wanted to say something earlier, didn't you?" Jimin stayed silent. The question had touched something he had been avoiding. "Hi, Young," he finally said. "Have you ever felt like everyone is moving forward, but you're scared that one day you'll suddenly not be able to keep up?" Suga leaned against the wall beside him. "More times than you know." Jimin looked down. "I don't want to become a burden." Suga immediately turned toward him. "Listen carefully. You are not a burden because you're human." The words were simple, but Jimin's expression changed. For a brief moment, the wall he had built began to weaken. But before the conversation could go further, a staff member suddenly rushed into the hallway. Their expression was serious. They were holding a phone with a message that had just arrived from the medical team. "We need to talk about what happened last night." Everyone nearby became quiet. Suga looked at Jimin, then at the staff member. Something about the tone made his heart sink. The message was not about a routine checkup anymore. It was about something Jimin had kept hidden even from the people closest to him. The staff member hesitated before speaking. "There is something you all need to know about why Jimin almost collapsed after the concert." The hallway suddenly felt smaller. The noise from outside disappeared. Jimin closed his eyes, realizing the secret he had tried to protect was no longer his alone. And somewhere in that moment, Suga understood that the painful truth he was about to hear might change the way he looked at Jimin forever. The hallway remained completely silent after those words left the staff member's mouth. For a moment, nobody moved. The members who had spent years reading each other's expressions suddenly found themselves unable to understand what they were seeing. Jimin stood still near the glass door, his hand slowly tightening around the edge of his jacket. He looked less like a global performer standing in a world-famous group and more like someone who had been caught carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried alone. Suga looked at him first, not at the staff member, not at the message on the phone, at Jimin, because even before hearing the details, he already knew one thing: the truth Jimin had hidden was not something small. The medical coordinator took a careful breath before explaining. "After reviewing what happened backstage last night, we noticed several warning signs. Jimin had been experiencing severe exhaustion for days, but he kept refusing additional rest because he didn't want to affect the schedule." The words landed heavily. Jungkook looked down, remembering how Jimin had smiled while saying he was fine. RM closed his eyes for a moment, replaying every conversation they had shared during the tour. J-Hope quietly placed a hand over his mouth, struggling with the realization that someone who always noticed everyone else's emotions had hidden his own so well. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jin asked softly. There was no anger in his voice, only sadness. Jimin lowered his head, because everyone was already tired. His voice became quieter. "I saw all of you working hard, the dancers, the crew, the staff. Everyone was giving everything. I thought if I said I couldn't do it, I would be the person slowing everyone down." Suga stared at him for several seconds. Those words reminded him of something he had once felt himself, the fear that needing help meant failing the people around you. But hearing Jimin say it out loud made that feeling different. It was painful because Suga knew Jimin had been suffering in silence while still trying to protect everyone else. "You thought we would see you as weak?" Suga asked. Jimin didn't answer immediately. That silence was enough. Suga looked away, trying to control his emotions. "Jimin, do you know what the hardest part is?" he said quietly. "It's not that you were struggling, it's that you were standing next to us every day and still felt like you had to face it alone." Jimin's eyes began to fill with tears, but he quickly looked down. He had spent so many years controlling his emotions in front of others that even crying felt like something he needed permission to do. Suga stepped closer. "Look at me." Slowly, Jimin raised his eyes. We didn't become 7 people because we needed 7 perfect people. We became 7 people because we needed each other. The room became emotional, but nobody interrupted. Every member understood the meaning behind those words. Their journey had never been about always being strong. It had always been about staying together when one person couldn't carry everything alone. Later that evening, the members canceled the unnecessary parts of their schedule and returned to the hotel earlier than planned. There was no dramatic announcement, no public explanation, no attempt to create attention around what happened. They simply chose to take care of someone who had spent years taking care of others. In the quiet hotel lounge, the 7 members sat together without cameras, without stage lights, and without the expectations of millions watching them. They were simply friends. Jungkook shared stories from their early trainee days, reminding Jimin of moments when they had struggled together before anyone knew their names. RM talked about how every person has moments when they need support, no matter how successful they become. J-Hope reminded him that the brightest people also need someone to protect their light sometimes. V joked gently that Jimin was terrible at hiding things because his face always revealed the truth before his words did. Even Jimin laughed at that. It was the first genuine laugh he had given all day, but Suga remained quiet for most of the night. He sat beside Jimin looking through the window at the city below. Finally, when everyone else had gone to their rooms, Suga spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Jimin nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was simple, but it carried years of friendship behind it. Jimin looked surprised. "Hyung," Suga continued, "I know you trust me. Sometimes I wonder if you trust me only when things are going well." Jimin immediately looked at him. "That's not true." "Then let me be there when things aren't going well too." The sentence stayed between them. No dramatic music, no perfect speech. Just 2 people who cared about each other realizing that love and friendship were not only about sharing happiness. They were also about allowing someone else to see the difficult moments. Jimin finally whispered, "I was scared." Suga nodded. "I know. I was scared that if people saw me struggling, they would think I wasn't enough." Suga looked at him and replied, "The people who truly care about you don't love you because you're always strong. They love you because you're you." For the first time in many days, Jimin allowed himself to stop pretending. He didn't need to perform. He didn't need to smile. He didn't need to convince anyone that everything was okay. He could simply sit there beside someone who understood. But neither of them realized that the emotional moment between them would soon become the beginning of something much bigger. Because the following night, during a private gathering with the concert crew and the people who had supported the tour from behind the scenes, one unexpected event would reveal just how many lives Jimin had quietly touched, and why Suga's reaction to that revelation would leave everyone in tears. The following evening, the atmosphere was completely different from the chaos of the previous days. There were no flashing cameras, no screaming crowds, and no pressure to deliver another perfect performance. The members had gathered in a smaller private space inside the venue, a quiet room usually reserved for staff meetings and final tour preparations. The walls were covered with handwritten messages from dancers, musicians, and crew members who had worked alongside them throughout the journey. Warm yellow lights replaced the harsh brightness of the stage, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a workplace and more like a room filled with memories. Outside, rain continued to fall softly against the windows, making the distant sounds of the city almost disappear. It was the kind of night where people naturally lowered their voices and spoke a little more honestly. The gathering had originally been planned as a simple thank you dinner for the touring crew. After months of rehearsals, flights, performances, and countless hours spent together, everyone wanted one final moment to appreciate the people who had helped make the tour possible. Jimin sat quietly at the end of the table, listening as different crew members shared stories about their favorite moments. He smiled when they talked about funny mistakes during rehearsals, unexpected problems that turned into memories, and small acts of kindness that never appeared in front of the audience. But there was one person he had not noticed yet. A young backstage assistant named Daniel stood near the doorway, holding a small envelope in his hands. Unlike the others, Daniel was not a senior member of the production team. He was someone who had joined the tour only months earlier, still learning and trying to prove himself in a demanding industry. He looked nervous as he approached. "Jimin," he said softly. The room slowly became quiet. Jimin looked up with a surprised expression. "Yes." Daniel held the envelope tightly. "I wanted to give you this before everyone leaves." Jimin accepted it carefully. "What is it?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Just something I wrote. You don't have to read it now." But something about his expression made Jimin open it immediately. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first few lines were simple, but as Jimin continued reading, his expression changed. Daniel explained that before working on the tour, he had been close to leaving the music industry completely. He had spent years trying to become a musician but felt invisible and unsuccessful. After losing confidence in himself, he accepted a backstage position because he thought being close to music was better than losing it completely. Then he described one particular night during rehearsal. Everyone was exhausted. The crew was rushing. Many people were focused only on finishing the schedule. But Jimin had stopped walking, turned around, and personally thanked every person working behind the scenes. Daniel wrote that those few seconds changed how he viewed himself. "You made me feel like my work mattered," the letter said. "I had spent years thinking I was just someone standing behind other people. But that night, you reminded me that every person has a place in the story." Jimin lowered the letter slowly. His eyes became emotional. He looked toward Daniel and said, "I don't even remember that moment." Daniel smiled. "That's why it meant so much. You didn't do it because anyone was watching." The words affected everyone in the room, because they revealed something about Jimin that cameras could never fully capture. The kindness he showed was not a performance. It existed even when nobody was recording. Suga watched silently from across the table. He noticed something that others might have missed. Jimin was not crying because he was being praised. He was emotional because he was realizing that the small things he considered ordinary had become unforgettable moments for other people. After Daniel returned to his seat, Suga quietly looked at Jimin. "Do you understand now?" he asked. Jimin glanced at him. "Understand what?" "You keep thinking your value comes from how much you can give on stage, but people remember you because of who you are when the stage is gone." Jimin looked down, absorbing those words. For years, he had measured himself through performances, achievements, and the ability to make others happy. But he rarely considered the impact of simple human moments. A greeting, a thank you, a few seconds of attention given to someone who felt invisible. The room became quieter as more people began sharing their own stories about Jimin and the members. A dancer talked about how Jimin encouraged her after an injury. A musician mentioned how Suga stayed late to help younger performers feel comfortable during recordings. A lighting technician described how RM always asked about the crew's well-being before discussing schedules. Each story revealed a side of their journey that audiences rarely saw. They were not just artists standing under lights. They were people creating connections in ordinary moments. Later, after everyone had left, Jimin and Suga remained in the empty room. The chairs were slightly scattered. Half-finished cups of coffee remained on the table. The sounds of laughter from earlier had disappeared, leaving only the soft hum of the building. Jimin looked at the handwritten messages on the wall. He said quietly. "Maybe I spent too much time trying to prove that I was strong." Suga leaned back in his chair. "Maybe," Jimin smiled faintly. "And maybe I forgot that strength can also mean letting people care about you." Suga nodded. "Now you're finally understanding." They sat there for a while without speaking. Two friends who had shared stages, hardships, dreams, and years of memories. Neither needed to say more. But then Jimin noticed something unusual. Suga looked exhausted. His face was pale and his hands rested unusually still on the table. Jimin asked. "Are you okay?" Suga immediately smiled. "I'm fine." The familiar words suddenly sounded different. Jimin stared at him and remembered everything Suga had told him earlier. The importance of allowing others to help. The danger of hiding pain behind a smile. For the first time, Jimin saw the same habit in Suga that he had been guilty of himself. Before he could say anything else, Suga stood up slowly. He tried to laugh it off, but his expression changed for a moment. The room became silent. Jimin reached out instinctively. Suga looked at him, and for a brief second both of them understood something important. They had spent years protecting each other. But sometimes, the hardest thing was admitting that both of them needed protection too. And the moment that followed would become the turning point neither of them expected. The moment Suga tried to take another step, the room seemed to shift into slow motion. The exhaustion he had hidden behind calm expressions for days finally became visible. His hand reached toward the edge of the table, searching for balance, but his fingers barely touched the surface before his strength disappeared. Jimin reacted instantly. "Hyung." His voice broke through the silence as he rushed forward and caught Suga before he could fall completely. The chair behind them moved loudly across the floor, creating a sudden sound that made everyone nearby turn around. Within seconds, the quiet room transformed into panic. Staff members hurried back inside. Jungkook, who had just returned to collect his jacket, froze at the doorway. RM immediately called for medical assistance while Jin and J-Hope moved closer, their faces filled with concern. But Jimin heard none of it clearly. All he could focus on was Suga's face. The same person who had spent the entire day telling him he did not have to carry everything alone was now the one who had collapsed in his arms. "Hyung, open your eyes," Jimin whispered, holding him carefully. "Please look at me." Suga slowly opened his eyes. He was conscious, but his expression showed the exhaustion he had been trying to hide. "I'm okay," he murmured automatically. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jimin's expression changed. It was not anger, it was something deeper. A mixture of fear and sadness. "No," Jimin said quietly. "Don't say that." Suga looked at him. Jimin swallowed hard. "You told me not to hide behind those words." The sentence immediately reminded Suga of their conversation the previous night. The room became silent as everyone understood what was happening. The person who had encouraged Jimin to accept help was now being forced to accept the same lesson himself. The medical team arrived shortly after and confirmed that Suga's condition was caused by severe exhaustion and lack of proper rest. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible to recover from, but enough to reveal a truth everyone had ignored. They had all been pushing themselves beyond their limits because they were afraid of disappointing others. While Suga rested in a nearby room, the members remained together. Nobody wanted to leave. The usual jokes and playful conversations were gone. Instead, they sat quietly, each person reflecting on the past months. RM looked at the floor and spoke first. "Maybe we became too good at pretending everything was normal." Jin nodded slowly. "We always notice when something happens to someone else, but sometimes we forget to look at ourselves." J-Hope looked toward the closed door where Suga was resting. "We spend so much time telling fans to love themselves. We should remember to do that too." Jimin remained silent. He was still processing everything. Only hours earlier, he had been the person everyone worried about. Now he was sitting there realizing that the people beside him had their own invisible struggles. When Suga finally woke up, the first thing he asked was not about himself. It was about Jimin. "Is he okay?" The nurse looked surprised. "You just woke up and you're asking about someone else." Suga gave a small smile. "That's just how he is too." When Jimin entered the room, neither of them spoke at first. There was no need. They both understood the strange irony of what had happened. Jimin sat beside the bed and quietly placed a bottle of water on the table. "Drink." Suga smiled slightly. "You're giving me orders now." "Yes," Jimin replied, "because you taught me how." A small laugh escaped from both of them. It was quiet but genuine. After a few moments, Jimin looked serious again. "I was scared when you fell." Suga looked away. "I know. For a second I thought." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Suga understood. He reached out and lightly tapped Jimin's hand. "I'm still here." Jimin nodded, trying to hold back his emotions. "You always tell me to let people stand beside me, so now I'm telling you the same thing." Suga looked at him. "What if I'm not used to it?" Jimin smiled sadly. "Then we'll learn together." Those words stayed with Suga because they represented something much bigger than that single night. They had spent years supporting millions of people through their music, but this moment reminded them that support had to exist between them too. The next morning, the story never reached the public in the dramatic way people might have expected. There were no rumors, no official statements filled with unnecessary details, and no attempt to turn a difficult moment into entertainment. The members and their team simply chose privacy and recovery. But one thing did spread among those who had witnessed it: the image of Jimin sitting beside Suga, refusing to leave until he knew his friend was truly okay. For the crew members who saw it, that moment represented the heart of their relationship. Not fame, not success, not the size of the stages they performed on. Just two friends who had spent years carrying each other's dreams and finally learned they were allowed to carry each other's pain too. Months later, when ARMY looked back on that period, they did not remember it because someone collapsed. They remembered it because they saw something more human than any performance could show. They saw that behind the lights, behind the achievements, and behind the global recognition, there were still people who needed kindness, understanding, and someone willing to stay. And for Jimin and Suga, that night became a quiet promise, a reminder that even the strongest bonds are not built by never falling. They are built by knowing someone will be there when you do. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a calmer rhythm. The intense schedule that had once filled every hour of every day was replaced with something the members rarely allowed themselves to have: time. Time to sleep without alarms. Time to sit together without rushing to the next destination. Time to remember that before they were performers standing under thousands of lights, they were simply 7 people who had grown together through years of uncertainty, pressure, and dreams. For Jimin, the aftermath of that night was not about fear or regret. It was about learning a lesson he had spent years avoiding. He began paying closer attention to the small signs his body and mind were sending him. Not because someone forced him to slow down, but because he finally understood that taking care of himself was not a selfish act. It was a way of respecting the people who cared about him. One quiet afternoon in the practice room, Jimin stood alone in front of the mirror. The room looked exactly the same as it had countless times before: the same wooden floor, the same speakers in the corner, the same reflections staring back at him. But something about the place felt different. In the past, he would look into that mirror and immediately analyze every movement, every mistake, every detail that needed improvement. That day, he simply stood there and smiled at himself, not the practice smile he gave during performances, a real one, a smile from someone who was finally accepting that he did not need to be perfect to be valuable. When Suga returned to practice, the members noticed a subtle change in him as well. He still had the same quiet personality, the same sharp observations, and the same habit of expressing care through actions rather than words. But now, when someone asked if he was tired, he no longer immediately answered with "I'm fine." Sometimes he would pause and honestly say, "Yeah, a little." And strangely, that simple answer brought everyone closer. The members began creating small habits that they had never prioritized before. They checked on each other more often. They ate together after long days instead of separating immediately. They reminded each other to rest without feeling guilty. It was not a dramatic transformation that happened overnight. It was a collection of small choices that slowly changed the way they supported one another. Behind the scenes, the staff members who had witnessed everything also carried the memory differently. For them, the moment was not about an artist struggling. It was about seeing the humanity behind people who were often viewed as untouchable. One of the concert coordinators later shared with the team that what stayed with her most was not the fear when Suga collapsed. It was what happened afterward. "The first thing Jimin did was not think about himself," she said. "He only cared that Suga was okay. And the same thing happened when Jimin was struggling. Everyone immediately stood beside him." That simple observation reminded everyone that true support was rarely found in grand gestures. Often it appeared in quiet moments, a hand reaching out, a person staying a little longer, or someone finally saying, "I need help." The story also affected people outside their immediate circle. Among ARMY, discussions began about the importance of recognizing the person behind the artist. Fans shared their own experiences of hiding exhaustion, pretending to be okay, and feeling afraid of disappointing others. Many said the message they took from that period was not about sadness, but about compassion. They talked about how easy it was to admire someone's strength while forgetting that strong people also needed care. Meanwhile, Daniel, the backstage assistant whose letter had touched Jimin, continued working in the music industry. But his confidence had changed. He no longer saw himself as someone standing in the background. He began writing songs again and eventually shared his own music with others. Whenever someone asked what inspired him to continue, he always remembered the same moment, the night someone made him feel visible, not because of a huge speech, not because of a life-changing announcement, simply because someone stopped and said thank you. Months later, during a private recording session, Jimin found the old notebook containing fan letters and personal messages. He opened it again and discovered the letter from Ethan, the young fan who had written about learning that even people who inspire others need to take care of themselves. Jimin smiled quietly while reading it. The message felt different now. Before, he had focused only on the part where he helped someone else. Now, he understood the second part, the reminder that he also deserved the same kindness. That evening, Suga joined him in the studio. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of equipment screens and the quiet sound of a new melody played through the speakers. Suga looked at the notebook on the table and smiled. "Still keeping those?" Jimin nodded. "They remind me why we do this." Suga sat beside him. "And what do they remind you now?" Jimin thought for a moment before answering. "That people don't need us to be perfect." He looked toward Suga. "They just need us to be real." Suga nodded slowly. For both of them, the experience had changed something they could not easily explain. It did not erase the pressure of their careers. It did not make difficult days disappear. But it changed the way they faced those days. They no longer saw vulnerability as something to hide. They saw it as a bridge that allowed people to come closer. And while the world would continue watching their performances, their achievements, and their public moments, the people closest to them remembered something much simpler. The most meaningful performance was not always the one happening on stage. Sometimes, it was the quiet act of staying beside someone when the lights went out. Years passed, and the memory of that night slowly became less about the moment of fear and more about the lesson it left behind. Time softened the details, the exact room where it happened, the schedule that had been changed, the conversations that took place after midnight. But the meaning remained clear for everyone who had been there. It became one of those quiet memories that people carried with them, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something deeply human about people who were often seen as larger than life. For Jimin and Suga, the experience became a turning point in the way they viewed their own journey. They still performed on massive stages. They still faced demanding schedules. They still carried the responsibility of being artists admired by millions around the world. But there was a difference now. They no longer believed that strength meant silently carrying everything alone. They learned that asking for support was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that trust existed. In the years that followed, small changes became visible to the people around them. During rehearsals, Jimin became the first person to remind others to rest when he noticed someone pushing too hard. He would laugh when the members pointed out the irony. "I'm just returning the advice you gave me," he would say. Suga, who had always expressed affection through actions rather than words, became more open about checking in with others. Before important performances, he would sometimes walk through the waiting area and ask simple questions. "Did you eat? Did you sleep? Are you feeling okay?" They were ordinary questions, but everyone understood the meaning behind them. They were his way of saying, "I see you." The other members also carried that lesson forward. RM often reminded younger artists and staff members that success should not come at the cost of personal well-being. Jin continued using humor to make people feel comfortable, but he also became more willing to show when he needed support himself. J-Hope encouraged those around him to celebrate small victories, not only major achievements. Jungkook became more aware that even the strongest-looking people around him had moments when they needed someone beside them. V continued bringing warmth and laughter. Understanding that emotional support could sometimes come through simple moments of happiness. The backstage crew who had witnessed that period also remembered it for years. For them, it became an example of why the environment behind a stage mattered just as much as the performance itself. They understood that artists were not machines designed to deliver perfect moments. They were people who experienced exhaustion, fear, uncertainty, and hope just like anyone else. Daniel, the young assistant whose letter had started one of the most emotional conversations of that journey, eventually achieved his own dream. He did not become famous overnight. There was no sudden breakthrough that changed his entire life in one moment. Instead, he built his career slowly, learning, creating, and continuing even when things were difficult. Years later, he met Jimin again at a music event. This time, Daniel was no longer the nervous assistant standing quietly at the edge of the room. He was a confident musician who had written songs inspired by his own experiences. When they spoke, Daniel thanked Jimin again, but Jimin smiled and shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" Jimin replied, "Because you were the one who reminded me of something I forgot." Daniel asked what that was. Jimin looked around at the people working behind the scenes, the musicians preparing equipment, and the staff moving quietly around the venue. That every person has a story, and every person deserves to be seen. That sentence stayed with Daniel for a long time. It was the same message he had once written in a letter, but now he heard it from someone who had learned the same lesson himself. Meanwhile, ARMY around the world continued sharing how moments like these changed their perspective. Many fans talked about how they began paying more attention to the people around them. Friends who finally admitted they were struggling. Family members who needed someone to listen. Strangers who simply needed kindness. The story had never been about one person saving another. It was about people learning that everyone carries something invisible. Some struggles appear on the surface. Others remain hidden behind smiles, achievements, and the words, "I'm okay." Years later, when Jimin and Suga looked back at their journey, they did not remember that night as a failure or a difficult moment they wished had never happened. They remembered it as a reminder that even after reaching incredible heights, people still need connection. They still need honesty. They still need someone who will sit beside them when they are tired and say, "You don't have to face this alone." Because the greatest legacy of that moment was not a headline, a viral clip, or a story shared across the world. The greatest legacy was much quieter. It was the number of people who learned that caring for themselves and caring for others were not separate things. They were connected. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is not to stand stronger than everyone else. Sometimes, it is to reach out and allow someone else to stand beside them. Years after that unforgettable chapter, the memory remained not because of the fear that filled that room, but because of the kindness that followed it. The world would continue to remember Jimin and Suga through performances, music, achievements, and countless moments shared with millions of fans. But for the people who were there that night, the most meaningful memory was never about a stage, a spotlight, or a record-breaking crowd. It was about two friends sitting in a quiet room after everything had gone silent, finally allowing each other to be human. In a world where people are often celebrated only when they appear strong, perfect, and unstoppable, their experience carried a different message. It showed that behind every smile, there can be a story that nobody sees. Behind every person who gives comfort to others, there is also someone who sometimes needs comfort themselves. Jimin once believed that protecting the people he loved meant hiding his struggles from them. Suga once believed that carrying responsibility quietly was part of being dependable. But they both learned that true friendship is not built on pretending to have no weaknesses. It is built on trust, the kind of trust that allows someone to say, "I'm not okay today," and still know they will be accepted. The lights of the stage will always be bright. The cheers of the audience will always be powerful. The world will always celebrate the moments that happen in front of everyone. But some of the most important moments in life happen far away from the cameras. A hand reaching out before someone falls. A person staying when leaving would be easier. A simple conversation that reminds someone they are not alone. Those moments may never become headlines, but they can change a person's entire life. For Jimin and Suga, that night became a quiet promise they carried forward, not a promise to never struggle again because everyone struggles. It was a promise to never ignore those struggles when they appear, to ask one more question, to listen a little longer, to notice the small changes that others might miss. And perhaps that is the lesson that remained with everyone who heard their story. Strength is not measured by how much pain a person can hide. Strength is found in the courage to be honest, the humility to accept help, and the compassion to offer that same support to someone else. Because every person, no matter how admired, successful, or strong they appear, has moments when they need someone beside them. Maybe that person is a friend. Maybe it is family. Maybe it is someone who simply chooses to care. But those connections are what make difficult moments easier to survive. So if there is one question left after this story, perhaps it is not about what happened on that night. It is about something closer to home. How many people around us are quietly carrying a burden while telling everyone they are fine? And if we noticed, would we walk past them? Or would we be the person who stays? Let us know your thoughts. Sometimes, a single moment of kindness can become the reason someone finds the strength to continue. The first snow of winter fell quietly over the city, covering the streets with a layer of white that softened every sound around it. Inside a small recording studio, far away from the noise of cameras and public attention, Jimin sat in front of a microphone while listening to a melody that had been created months earlier. The room was warm, illuminated only by the soft glow of the equipment screens, and a small lamp placed beside a collection of handwritten notes. On the table was the same notebook he had carried for years, the one filled with messages from people whose lives had somehow crossed with his. He turned another page and paused. There was no sadness in his expression this time, only gratitude. The memories that once felt heavy had become reminders of how far he had come. A quiet knock came from the door. Jimin looked up and smiled when he saw Suga standing there with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "You still work this late?" Suga asked. Jimin laughed softly. "You're saying that?" Suga smiled because he knew the irony. Some habits were difficult to change, even after learning important lessons. But the difference was that now they noticed those habits in each other. They no longer waited until someone reached a breaking point before asking if they were okay. Suga placed the coffee beside him and looked around the studio. "What are you working on?" Jimin played a small part of the unfinished song. The melody was gentle, carrying a feeling that was difficult to describe. It sounded like a conversation between 2 people who had experienced difficult days but chose to keep walking together. Suga listened quietly until the music stopped. "It sounds different," he said. Jimin looked curious. "Different how?" Suga thought for a moment. "Like you're not trying to prove anything anymore." Jimin smiled. He understood exactly what Suga meant. For years, he had chased perfection because he believed that was the only way to repay the love people gave him. But now he understood something deeper. People did not connect with perfection. They connected with honesty. They connected with the moments when someone showed their real self. "I think we spent so much time trying to become someone everyone could be proud of," Jimin said quietly, "that we forgot we were already people worth caring about." Suga looked at him and nodded. "Took us long enough to figure that out." They both laughed. It was a simple moment, but it represented years of friendship. Years of challenges, growth, misunderstandings, and unconditional support. Outside the studio, the world continued moving quickly. New songs would be released. New stages would be prepared. New memories would be created. But inside that small room, 2 friends understood something that success alone could never teach them. The most valuable things were often invisible. The conversations no one heard, the support no one recorded, the moments when someone chose to stay. Later that night, before leaving the studio, Jimin looked once more at the notebook filled with letters. He added a new page, not from a fan, not from a staff member, but from himself. The message was short. "Remember that you don't have to carry everything alone." He closed the notebook and placed it carefully beside the microphone. Because sometimes the lessons we need most are the ones we finally learn to tell ourselves. And somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the stages, and beyond the expectations of the world, the story of Jimin and Suga remained a quiet reminder. People may remember the performances they witnessed, but they will never forget the kindness they felt. The years continued to move forward, bringing new seasons, new challenges, and new chapters that nobody could predict. The world outside changed constantly, but some things remained unchanged. the quiet understanding between Jimin and Suga, the way they could sit in the same room without speaking and still know what the other person was feeling, the way a simple glance could replace a long conversation. Their friendship had never been defined only by the biggest moments. It was built through thousands of small ones that nobody else ever saw. A cup of coffee left on a table after a long night, a message sent just to ask if someone had eaten, a quiet presence during difficult days. Those were the moments that became the foundation of everything. One evening, during a private gathering with the members and longtime staff, someone brought up old memories from their early days. Everyone laughed while watching old practice videos, remembering how young they were, how uncertain the future looked, and how many times they questioned whether their dreams would become reality. The room filled with familiar laughter, but then the conversation slowly turned toward the challenges they had faced along the way. RM looked around at everyone and said something that made the room become quiet. "I think we always believed success would be the hardest part, but maybe learning how to handle success together was the real journey." Nobody disagreed, because they had discovered that reaching a dream was only one part of the story. Protecting the people who shared that dream with you was something completely different. Jimin listened quietly, looking around the room at the people who had stood beside him through countless moments. He remembered the night when he thought hiding his pain was a way of protecting others. Now he understood that allowing people to help was also a form of love. Suga, sitting nearby, noticed Jimin's expression and smiled slightly. "Thinking too much again?" he asked. Jimin laughed. "Maybe." "Still doing that?" Suga teased. "Always." The small exchange made everyone smile. It was ordinary, almost meaningless to anyone watching from the outside, but that was exactly why it mattered. Their strongest moments were not always dramatic. Sometimes, they were simply moments where they could still laugh together after everything they had experienced. Later that night, as everyone slowly left, Jimin and Suga remained behind for a few extra minutes. The empty room reminded them of the many places they had once stood together: practice rooms before debut, backstage corridors before performances, recording studios during difficult creative moments. Different places, different years, but the same feeling. "Do you ever think about that night?" Jimin asked softly. Suga looked toward the window. "Sometimes." "Do you regret it?" Jimin asked. Suga took a moment before answering. "No." Jimin looked surprised. "Even though it was difficult," Suga nodded. "Because if that moment never happened, maybe we would have kept pretending we were okay forever." The answer stayed with Jimin. Difficult moments were not always something to erase from memory. Sometimes they became the moments that taught people how to care better, how to listen better, how to understand each other more deeply. Before leaving, Suga turned off the final light in the room. The darkness arrived slowly, but neither of them felt uncomfortable. They had learned that not every meaningful moment needed a spotlight. Some of the most important things happened quietly. And as they walked through the empty hallway together, they carried the same lesson they had learned years before. Behind every person is a story that others may never see. Behind every smile is a feeling that may never be spoken. But kindness has a way of reaching places that words cannot. The world would continue watching the stages, the music, and the achievements. But the people who truly understood their journey knew something different. The greatest moments were not only the ones performed in front of thousands. They were the moments when one person looked at another and simply said, "I'm here." And sometimes, that is the one thing someone needs most. Time had a way of changing the meaning of memories. What once felt like a painful moment became a quiet reminder of growth. What once felt like a moment of fear became proof that people could find strength through honesty and connection. For Jimin and Suga, the experience never became a story they shared to seek sympathy. It remained something much more personal, a reminder of the responsibility they had toward themselves and toward the people who walked beside them. Years later, during a conversation with younger artists backstage, Jimin noticed someone sitting alone in the corner of the waiting area. The young performer had just finished a major event and was surrounded by congratulations from others, yet there was a distant look in his eyes. A look Jimin recognized immediately. It was the same expression he once carried when he smiled for everyone while quietly struggling inside. Instead of walking past, Jimin sat beside him, "Long day?" he asked gently. The young artist nodded. "I should be happy. This is what I dreamed about, but somehow I still feel exhausted." Jimin smiled softly. "I know that feeling." The young artist looked surprised. "You do?" Jimin looked toward the empty stage beyond the hallway. The lights had already been turned off, leaving only a faint glow from the equipment. Sometimes people think achieving a dream means you will never feel tired again, but dreams don't remove the fact that we're human. Those words stayed with the young artist. They were not a perfect solution. They did not erase every difficult feeling, but they gave him something important, the feeling that someone understood. From a distance, Suga watched the conversation and smiled. He knew exactly what Jimin was doing. He was passing forward the same kindness that had once been given to him. Later that night, Suga mentioned it casually. "You became the person you needed back then." Jimin looked at him and smiled. "Maybe we both did." That answer represented everything they had learned. They had not become stronger because they stopped struggling. They became stronger because they stopped hiding those struggles from the people who cared about them. The members continued carrying that philosophy in their own ways. Their conversations became more honest. Their support for each other became more natural. They no longer waited for a crisis before showing concern. They learned to appreciate the ordinary moments, the meals shared after exhausting days, the laughter during rehearsals, the quiet conversations during long journeys. Because life was not only made of unforgettable events. Most of it was built from small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A few words, a simple gesture, a decision to stay. And sometimes, those small moments became the memories people carried forever. Looking back, the night when everything changed was never truly about someone falling. It was about what happened afterward. It was about people choosing compassion over silence. It was about friendship becoming stronger through honesty. It was about understanding that even those who inspire millions still need someone to remind them they are cared for. The world would always remember the songs, the stages, and the achievements, but the people closest to them would remember something much simpler. They would remember two friends who learned that being strong did not mean standing alone. It meant knowing there would always be someone willing to stand beside you. And perhaps that was the most meaningful lesson of all. Not that people never break, but that healing often begins the moment someone reaches out and says, "You don't have to go through this by yourself." There are moments in life that do not change everything immediately, but quietly change the way people see everything afterward. For Jimin and Suga, that moment was never remembered as the night when something went wrong. It became the night when they finally understood something they had spent years forgetting, that even the strongest bonds require honesty, and even the strongest people need somewhere to rest. As the years continued, the memory followed them not as a painful reminder, but as a source of gratitude. Whenever they faced difficult schedules, overwhelming expectations, or moments of uncertainty, they remembered the promise they made to each other in that quiet room. A promise not to be perfect. A promise not to hide. A promise to notice when someone beside them was silently struggling. During another tour preparation years later, the members gathered in a familiar rehearsal space. The room looked different from the one where they had started their journey, but the feeling was strangely similar. Music filled the speakers. Footsteps echoed across the floor. Laughter interrupted serious practice sessions. It was another ordinary day, yet everyone understood how precious those ordinary days had become. Jimin watched the members joking with each other and smiled. There was a time when he believed every moment had to be extraordinary to matter. Now he knew better. The quiet moments were often the ones that stayed the longest. Suga noticed him smiling from across the room. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Jimin looked around before answering. "Just realizing how much has changed." Suga nodded. "And how much hasn't?" Jimin smiled because he understood. The stages became bigger. The world became larger. The responsibilities increased. But the reason they continued was still the same, the people standing beside them. Later that evening, after rehearsal ended, the members sat together sharing stories from the past. They laughed about mistakes they once thought were embarrassing and remembered moments they never expected to survive. Every story carried the same theme. They had never made it through challenges because they were always strong. They made it through because they were never alone. Outside the building, fans continued waiting with messages of support. Some had followed their journey for years. Others had discovered their music recently. Different generations, different backgrounds, different stories. But many shared one thing in common: the feeling that the music had given them comfort during moments when they needed it most. Jimin often thought about that connection. Not because he believed he could save everyone, but because he understood something more realistic. Sometimes people do not need someone to fix their problems. Sometimes they only need a reminder that someone understands. Suga carried the same belief. Through his music, his words, and his quiet actions, he continued showing that emotions did not need to be hidden to be respected. The person who once struggled to admit he was tired became someone who encouraged others to acknowledge their own limits. The person who once feared becoming a burden became someone who understood that allowing others to help was a gift. And somewhere along the way, both of them discovered that healing was not a single moment. It was a process. It happened through conversations, through patience, through forgiveness, and through choosing each day to care a little more. The story that began with fear ended with understanding. The moment that started with someone falling became a reminder of how many people were willing to reach out. Because in the end, what people remember most is rarely the difficult moment itself. They remember who stayed. They remember who listened. They remember who made them feel less alone. And perhaps that is why this story continued to matter. Not because of a collapse, not because of a hidden struggle, but because it revealed something universal. Behind every person admired by the world is still a human being searching for the same things everyone else seeks: understanding, acceptance, and someone who will quietly say, "I'm here." The world rarely notices the quiet promises people make when nobody is watching. There are no cameras capturing those moments, no headlines announcing them, and no crowds cheering when they happen. But sometimes, those silent promises become the foundation that carries people through the hardest days. For Jimin and Suga, the promise they made was never spoken in front of an audience. It existed only between two friends who had experienced the weight of expectations and discovered that they did not have to carry it alone. Years after that unforgettable chapter, the members found themselves gathered once again in a familiar studio. The room was filled with the sounds of creativity, the soft rhythm of unfinished melodies, conversations between producers, and the occasional laughter that broke the serious atmosphere. It felt like every other recording session, yet there was something different. There was a sense of peace that had taken years to build. Jimin sat near the window, watching the city below. The lights from thousands of buildings reflected across the glass, creating a view that reminded him of countless nights spent traveling from one place to another. There had been moments when those lights represented pressure. Now, they represented memories. Suga entered the room quietly and placed a drink beside him, just as he had done many times before. "You still like sitting here alone?" he asked. Jimin smiled. "Sometimes," Suga nodded. "Thinking too much? Probably." They both laughed because some things never changed. But this time the silence afterward felt different. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who no longer needed to explain everything. "Do you remember when you thought you had to protect everyone by hiding how you felt?" Suga asked. Jimin looked down and smiled slightly. "I remember." "Do you still think that?" Jimin paused. The honest answer took a moment. "No, not anymore." Suga looked at him. Jimin continued, "Because I learned something. Sometimes people don't need me to be the strongest person in the room. Sometimes they just need me to be there." Suga nodded slowly. Those words reflected a lesson they had both spent years learning. Being there for someone did not always mean having the perfect answer. It did not always mean solving every problem. Sometimes it simply meant staying beside them while they found their own way forward. Later that evening, the members gathered for dinner. The conversation moved naturally from music to memories, from jokes about their younger days to stories about the people they had met throughout their journey. Everyone laughed, interrupted each other, and created the same familiar atmosphere they had shared for years. For a moment, it was easy to forget the stages, the awards, and the expectations surrounding them. They were simply friends sharing a meal. And perhaps that was the greatest achievement they had found, not the ability to reach the highest stages, but the ability to remain connected despite everything that came with them. Before leaving, Jimin looked around the empty room one final time. The same kind of room had once held fear and uncertainty. Now it held something different: gratitude. He thought about all the people who had quietly helped him along the way, the members who noticed when he was struggling, the staff who cared beyond schedules, the fans who reminded him that honesty mattered more than perfection, the strangers whose stories had taught him that everyone carries something unseen. He realized that life was not a journey where people became strong enough to never fall again. It was a journey where people learned that falling did not mean failure when there were people willing to help them stand again. Outside, the night air was cool and calm. The city continued moving, unaware of the small but meaningful conversations that had taken place inside that building. But maybe that was how the most important moments worked. They did not always change the world loudly. Sometimes they changed one person, then another, until the kindness spread further than anyone expected. And somewhere between the memories of difficult days and the hope of future ones, Jimin and Suga carried the same understanding they had discovered long ago. The brightest lights are not always the ones shining on a stage. Sometimes, the brightest lights are the people who stay beside us when everything else becomes dark. Not every story continues because something extraordinary happens afterward. Some stories continue because the people involved quietly become different versions of themselves. They carry the lessons forward, allowing one difficult moment to influence countless ordinary days that follow. For Jimin and Suga, the experience became one of those memories that never needed to be publicly explained to remain meaningful. It stayed between them, between the members, and between the people who witnessed the kindness that followed. Years later, during a conversation after a long recording session, Jimin and Suga found themselves discussing how much their perspective had changed. The studio was almost empty. Most of the staff had already left, and the only sound came from the faint hum of the equipment still running in the background. Jimin looked at the unfinished lyrics on the screen and smiled. "I think we used to believe that success meant proving we could handle everything." Suga leaned back in his chair and listened. "And now?" Jimin looked around the room before answering. "Now I think success is also knowing when to let people stand beside you." Suga nodded. He understood exactly what Jimin meant, because sometimes the hardest battles were not the ones happening in front of thousands of people. They were the silent battles happening inside a person who continued smiling while carrying something heavy. That realization changed the way they interacted with everyone around them. They became more aware of the people who worked quietly behind the scenes, the staff members who arrived before everyone else, the musicians who stayed late perfecting small details, the dancers who gave everything during rehearsals, the fans who carried their own struggles while finding comfort in music. They learned that every person had a story, even the people who were rarely noticed. One day, during another performance preparation, Jimin noticed a young crew member sitting alone after rehearsal. The person looked exhausted but kept insisting everything was fine when someone asked. Jimin recognized that familiar answer immediately. He remembered the same words he had repeated countless times. "I'm okay." 3 simple words that could hide so much. Instead of walking away, Jimin sat beside him. He did not give a long speech. He did not try to fix everything. He simply stayed and asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" That question was enough. Because sometimes what people need most is not advice. It is permission to stop pretending. Later, when Suga heard about the moment, he smiled. "You finally understand." Jimin looked confused. "Understand what?" Suga replied. "That the kindness you give others is also something you deserve." Jimin became quiet for a moment. Those words carried the weight of everything they had learned together. The journey had never been about becoming people who never struggled. It was about becoming people who no longer felt ashamed of struggling. It was about understanding that vulnerability was not the opposite of strength. Sometimes, it was the clearest proof of courage. As time continued, the memory of that night remained a reminder for everyone involved. For the members, it represented the importance of protecting each other beyond the stage. For the staff, It represented the humanity behind every performance. For Army, it became a reminder to look beyond appearances and remember that every person deserves care. And for Jimin and Suga, it became a quiet chapter in a friendship built over years of shared dreams, challenges, and unconditional support. The world would continue moving forward. New songs would be created. New stages would be built. New memories would replace old ones. But some lessons never disappear. The lesson that a person does not have to earn kindness. The lesson that asking for help is not failure. The lesson that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is simply our presence. Because in the end, people may forget certain moments, certain places, and certain words. But they rarely forget how someone made them feel when they needed support the most. And perhaps that is the true meaning of connection. Not being strong enough to walk every road alone, but knowing there will always be someone willing to walk beside you.